I would like to focus on some issues. I would like to look at how a place becomes owned by its inhabitants, which is not too far from the issues we were talking about, which is the idea of appropriation. I don't know if in English it works exactly as it in Italian. In Italian, appropriation has got a negative and a positive nuance. Negative is that when I appropriate, I also expropriate someone. I steal, basically. I make mine what is not mine. And possibly, usually it's because it is someone else's. But it also has a positive nuance, that is that I feel as it is mine. I feel as mine. I appropriate a cause, a political cause, a struggle, an idea. I feel it as mine. Proprio, in Italian, means own. No? So I make it mine. It is the idea of appropriation, the act of appropriation, is a way to connect to places, because I can appropriate ideas, but I can appropriate a belonging to a place. And therefore, I think it comes under the umbrella of what the word territoriality, which is not an easy word we chose, has. If we look at the military point of view, and let me quote Allen Ginsberg that says almost all of our language has been taxed by war, in Vicita Vortex Sutra. A space becomes a territory when it's controlled. Control is a notion not too far from the animal behavior. When we say in the background documents for the conference, territoriality is an anthropological concept derived from the observation of animal behavior, and it is concerned with how animals and humans demonstrate ownership and control. So the question is, possessing a place or appropriating a place, does it make it a territory? So shifting from place to territory is the possession, the appropriation of it, which would call into discussion the notion of power. And I would like to make reference to the theory of Chantal Mouffe, the hegemonic practice. Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau, probably many of you are familiar with, and it is based on the acknowledging of the hegemonic nature of every kind of social order acquired in a context of contingency practices through which this certain order is created. I'm not quoting her because my English is too bad, but I'm just trying to synthesize. How does the idea of hegemony tend to associate with owning, possessing places? But I can ask the contribution of an artist. A problem occurred. Yeah. You may know Lara Armarsegui. She is Spanish but living in Rotterdam. And this work of her is called Wasteland. And basically, it's the preservation of a plot of land for a number of years from any use or exploitation, any government, communal, whatever way decided, even agreeing, it is called Wasteland, provocatively, I think. Is it a territory or not? If we cannot exert power on it, if we cannot control it, does it become anyway a territory, exerting territoriality, generating territoriality? if we can appropriate not the actual plot of land, but the idea or the nature of it, does it accept a form of territoriality? Would we belong to this once we feel and understand it, although we don't own it as property or control? And talking about land, I couldn't help thinking of another very important project that you are already familiar with, by Tiravanija in Thailand, which is actually called The Land, and it was initiated in 1998 and came from merging of the ideas by different artists, I am quoting the website, to cultivate a place of and for social engagement. It continues, though initially the action to acquire the rice fields were initiated by 2 artists from Thailand, The Land, as a project, was initiated with anonymity and without the concept of ownership. The land was to be cultivated as an open space, though with certain intentions towards community, towards discussion, and towards experimentation in other fields of thoughts. There is here, I think, a latent but not so hidden reference to the idea of ownership. It does mention the word ownership. But ownership, it is intended as a form of negative appropriation. It doesn't say that, but I have a feeling that when it says it was initiated without the concept of ownership, it is an it's experimenting the abandoning, no? It's doing without the notion of appropriation. And it goes very close to the notion of common that has become a buzzword in today's cultural and not only cultural areas or discussions. Common, as we are aware, is not the same as public, and it doesn't mean neither state-owned nor private. And it comes to my self-spontaneous question, does a common territory exert territoriality as in a similar way to what Lara Almarseghi showed us? And if it is so, what kind of appropriation does a common territory, or even a common space, or a common place, allow, or even imply, the very nature of common, being common? Does it imply a different kind of appropriation, or appropriation aware of something that, on the contrary, other forms of ownership don't allow? To continue on this notion, or probably before the notion of appropriation of the land, there is the notion of landscape, which is itself a notion of an expression of an aspect of territoriality. Landscape already implies understanding the territory, a way of capturing the land, the territory through a concept, landscape. I want to recall the categorization that was developed by the Indian sociologist Aryan Appadurai on the 5 global dimensions of the notion of landscape. I would like to quote a sentence by Appadurai that I find seminal, although it may seem a bit out of context, but I think it is that, as I will try to touch upon, it is spot on. He says, imagination is today a possibility for action and not just for escaping. Now, to help me out, I would like... no, I cannot. Okay, never mind. Sorry. I wanted to show you some images. Let's pretend that we now see some images of mountains and rivers. I think we can. But I will quickly mention the 5 dimensions of landscape by Appadurai. Ethno-landscape, immersive and ever-changing landscape consisting of the people around us. Techno-landscape, the global configuration of technologies moving at high speed through the boundaries previously impervious. Financial landscape, the global network of currency speculation and capital transfer. Media landscape, the distribution of the ability to produce and disseminate information and the vast, complex repertoire of images and narratives generated by these capabilities. And 5th, idea landscape, made up of state ideologies and counter-ideologies by movements around which the nation-states have organized their political culture. Going back to Mouffe's analysis and trying to connect it with Appadurai's, what is the contemporary scenario we find? There are hegemonic narratives that tend to constitute a landscape, a representation, often aesthetically characterized, full of symbols, assumed to be immutable, natural, as these mountains and rivers and clouds. This crystallization is a result of this hegemonic narrative process. It establishes a specific political order, articulates forms of institutions, or organizational forms of the private, the intimate, the domestic. And I would like to quote again Gramsci, that says that regarding this constitutive process, he stressed the centrality of the artistic and cultural practices in the creation and spread of what he called common sense. Common sense, a specific worldview consolidated and shared by those in power and the widespread collective consciousness. Now, I move on to... I've got 5 minutes. Can you allow me a bit more because I have to talk about Città dell'Arte? Which, I will try to cut it a little bit short, but I wanted now to connect to more specifically Città dell'Arte's contribution to the project. Because Mouffe describes this dynamic, generative and transformative in terms of hegemony, antagonism, which is also something that Pistoletto in Città dell'Arte considers, but we tend to see in this dialectic, very Hegelian dialectics, a teleological nature, so a composition of the balance, which on the contrary Chantal Mouffe denies. And it is the principle, we gave it a name to this neo-Hegelian dialectic between two opposites. You remember thesis, synthesis, and thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. We call it the trinamics, trinamics, the dynamics of the number 3, that originates from the opposition, not always entirely oppositional, but also sometimes differentiation of elements. A duality organized by... This duality organizes and gives birth to a third element, did not exist before, and this is the creation process. Creation of ideas, of representations, but also creation of the objects, or the light, or the bodies, two elements to meet and create third body. Negative and positive meet and create the light, or so forth. This is a principle that is in nature and in societies and in our own mind or intellect. And it is represented by a symbol. And there's that one. Of course, this one. Which, again, of course, it represents the two opposites and a third circle, wider, where a project can take place. I know that hegemony and balance don't seem at all synonymous. Actually, they are probably unreconcilable. But if we take them in a dynamic sense, temporal sense, impermanent sense, the boundaries between the two distinct concepts, I think in some cases can even meet. I would like to make a quick reference to an experience of some creative workshops that we have developed over the years in our practice as direct in Città dell'Arte, in reference to the categories of landscape described by Appadurai. Landscape. No? We created a platform for researching and testing, experiencing the concept of counter landscape. In line with the notion of media landscape, and we know that hegemonies tend to use the media as a primary tool in the construction of representations and narratives that form the landscape in which we live. Opinion leaders, as well as artists, as pop singers, mainstream thinkers, journalists, and of course political leaders. For us, this is a given landscape. It looks like the result of narratives, but they are mainly built by the hegemonic powers who hold and can use the mass communication means. Despite the fact that access to the systems of expression and representation made available by the web don't lack, it seems, however, that it is impossible for us citizens as individuals to change the landscape in which we live. So much, of course, the physical one, but as well the ideal one of the ideas. Yet there are anywhere micro-narratives that they derive from the incessant imaginative making images, imaginative work that humans in every cultural and contextual determination inevitably produce, even in the oppressive conditions of totalitarian regimes or in the most alienative and destructive ones. These images resulting from this creatorial power of the human spirit contribute to the formation of a magmatic substratum of thought, ideas, and representations that may constitute a form of landscape where we move, surrounded from. These discourses tend to often counterbalance or try to possibly counterbalance the narrative that determined the media landscape. I know I'm aware of the time, so I will try to make the connection to Mouffe talks about critical artistic practices. And she defines them as those who in various ways help to upset dominant hegemony. This counter landscape stands in an antagonistic dialectical position to the prevailing scenery. And the trinamics would be sought in this clash or meeting between landscape and hegemonic landscape and counter landscape in establishing a balanced, unprecedented transition, once again hegemonic, as Chantal Mouffe would say, but it would be the permanent or possibly the unpermanent result of this temporary dialectic. So now the question is, if a counter landscape generates territory, and even more territoriality, if it does. Does this apply only to the one who produce counter-representation or also to others? To the ones who appropriate its spirit or vision, for example? And I would like to... This is Spark Fiction by Christoph Schäfer. I will not go too much into this, but we're not at all into that. But we're talking of making landscapes as a metaphor for making places. It's another buzzword of today. Place makers, not the artists, place makers. Making place, it is a recurring issue for actually many art practitioners as well. And it is one of the ways that connect art and politics in the past and today. If we look at the protest movements, Occupy, Indignados, and so forth, they seem enacted often with languages specific to the world of art, of artivism, as already it is another buzzword of today. Here we see that actually spaces of critique, dissent, antagonism, imaginative as well, antagonism are opened. But is it enough? This is Thomas Hirschhorn. Very bad. No, let's forget it. Imagine Thomas Hirschhorn, Gramsci Monument in New York. And I said, is it enough? Let's focus on a moment, for a second, on the gap that separates the subversive, antagonistic, counter-hegemonic, counter-landscape practices operating on the levels of deconstructing identities and subjectivities, juxtaposing images and narratives to the hegemonic landscape. But the hegemonic landscape is also administered, managed. There is an actual organization of coexistence with setting up institutions, creating state organization. I would call it the anatomy of the organizations and the physiology of institutions. Operating a city, organizing a health system, managing the army, the public apparatus, administrating production and distribution. So, yes. We've seen that. In 2002, at Territoriality, we realized an exhibition. It was curated by Dagmar Reichert that was entitled Critique is Not Enough. And we presented artistic practices that work directly in the organization of pragmatic elements of everyday life with ordinary citizens who were or not in distress. Critique is not enough. This was one project that was presented. Of course, when you propose something, it's implicit that you are criticizing what exists. When you create an alternative reality to existing models, the critique is implicit. You're not doing without critique, but you're starting from critique. But you're going farther. For example, an artist who I find extremely, extremely convincing is Rick Lowe in Houston. Do you know them? The project is called Row Houses, and he went from drawing graffiti murales in his neighborhood in Houston, very socially powerful. One day, in a meeting like this, a young man stood up and said, yes, Rick, but these murales you do, these drawings you do, what bring to us? What is the effect to us as a community? We know what you depict. You make a living out of that. Wonderful. And so Rick started off a project that now is well established of building houses. Homeless, the housing was a one of the biggest issues of the area, and he has now set up a good number of houses at very low cost. So also the inhabitants of these houses are not the rich or cool hipster class moving to and gentrifying an area, but it's the people who live there, possibly even the guy who stood up and said, "What the hell are you doing?" And I'm finishing now with this, although there will be more to say, because now I talked about critique is not enough.
You have to put off the wireless.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Grazie. Thank you. Grazie. This shift has led me to think of another word, a perversion of the word democracy that I call demopraxy. Demopraxy. That shifts the focus from the antagonistic discourse of kratos. Kratos is power in Greek. To the one of praxis. That means, of course, practice. And I feel that demopraxy has got something to do with the political projects that we've seen in regards to Europe flourishing in the 90s and 2000s, that we witnessed and easily dismissed as populist, neo-nationalistic, xenophobic, and localistic, what they generally were. But they also were feeding on the same matrix that has fueled projects that were later set up within the formalized political representation, parliamentary. In Italy, the Five Stars Party, Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, and also, well, I forget it. It's it. I would like just to mention to you this other project by Jonas Stahl, and going to the final point, we began investigating this diversive, perverted notion and vision of democracy, and we set up an archive of democratic projects which are active at very different levels, very different backgrounds, from environment to health, town planning to alternative forms of economic models. This is just an archive that is there to contribute to reflection and connection, and it's called the Geography of Change. Several hundred projects throughout the world where we feed from in our practice and in our reflection in Città dell'Arte. We connect, we invite experts, practitioners to share their experience and to join forces and give insights. This imagine, therefore, that you see that this is a territory. Oh, of course, it's quite generic, and it is in this. It is over other territories, capitalistic financial territories. So they coexist. They insist on the same portion of land. But the territories of change, what we call of transformation, creep into the hegemonized territory, and they define practices relating to space, relationship, exchange, production, that are different. And I will not go into the identity because it's too. But what I can say is, having mentioned this resource, we are wondering what are the ways to recognize and exercise territoriality in these antagonistic dynamics. How to strengthen these zones where already the active hegemonies are challenged in practice. How to extend them and contaminate them with them, the rest? Can the art system help? Or, as I was saying at the start, can a residency program or a not residency program strengthen this process? These are the issues we'd like to focus in our research within TIP, especially with the seminar that we'll hold in the next months in Città dell'Arte, with the participation of artists coming from the partners locales. Okay, I'm sorry if I was a bit disruptive, but I had to condensate, and I hope that I managed to give you some view of the thought, the frame where we're moving, and why we think that TIP can be very helpful for us, and hopefully to share with you. Okay.
Thank you.